You've probably heard that companies are starting to worry about their AI bills. They're watching token usage climb and asking what they'll owe Anthropic this month. And that's definitely worth monitoring. But there's a larger and more important number sitting in the software budget already. I think most companies are applying AI tools to the wrong kind of work. They give teams across the company ChatGPT enterprise access and expect productivity gains that correspond with the hype that they see on Twitter. But LLMs reason probabilistically, and most company workflows are fairly codified and deterministic. The real alpha, and in my opinion, the best way for companies to actually get a return on their investments, is to use LLMs primarily for the narrow deterministic use cases they're already excellent at today. And that use case is creating good old classic deterministic code. And what can you do with good deterministic code? 9 times out of 10, the best bang for your buck is just assembling a small team to rebuild the core systems that drive your business into a unified company operating system, all the while retiring expensive SaaS licenses one by one along the way. In this video, I'll walk through the napkin math that makes the case for SaaS replacement and show you where the risks and some unexpected value are hiding. But before the math, there's a trap that many organizations are waking up to as token budgets skyrocket. You probably noticed the model companies expanding up the stack. Anthropic now wants Claude working alongside your team in Slack through Claude Tag. OpenAI wants companies building workspace agents inside ChatGPT. Each company has a good reason to pull more of your workflow into its platform. But if your homegrown Salesforce replacement only works with Anthropic because you ported all your institutional knowledge into their database, all you've really done is move the dependency down a layer, and you're still beholden to somebody else's pricing and roadmap. And don't forget, these companies, they're all about to go public. Fortunately, there's a simple philosophy for how to manage all of this safely. You, as the driver of your company, should actually own your data model. You should own your workflow, logic, permissions, and tools. Sure, Fable 5 might be great for one workflow, but GPT 5.6 and Codex might be better for another. And maybe you should be using an open-weight, open-source model for a narrow task that requires high security controls. With a better model-agnostic approach where you control the harness, the wiring can change as pricing and capabilities evolve. So why take on a company operating system project now? This architecture has been possible for years, and coding agents aren't necessarily new. But a lot of people forget that it wasn't until November in 2025 that we got Opus 4.5, followed by GPT 5.2 in November. This stuff is very new. In our work at Runpoint Partners, these two releases were the inflection point that marked the threshold where models could plan across systems and finish complicated work reliably. Sure, even today, a capable human still has to review, test, secure, and own what actually ships, but the code comes much faster now. And as building gets cheaper, technical execution risk and timelines have fallen sharply. Today, it's often much more difficult to drive the organizational change and adoption required for a systems overhaul than it is to produce the actual tooling and software. But that's a topic for another video. So let's get down to the economics. It all starts with a simple audit. Make a spreadsheet of every SaaS product capturing your annual spend and the renewal date. Theoretically, somebody in operations should already have this. In practice, many companies don't, and that's okay. If you want to make this fun and a little silly, on our website, we turn the creation of this spreadsheet into a game where you can play a CEO tasked with hunting down contracts. That's all available, but really any format works. And this list, the resulting spreadsheet, is usually pretty revealing. Companies often buy heavy SaaS tools and use a tiny slice. And then your teams have to adapt to that vendor's template. When somebody asks for a change, it enters a product backlog that you don't control, and that request may sit there for years. We all know this story. So the SaaS audit gives us targets, but it also keeps you from rebuilding the wrong thing. A commodity tool costing a few $1,000s a year and working reasonably well is probably fine to leave alone. A more interesting target might be a CRM or a workflow tool that costs hundreds of thousands of dollars a year and actually constrains important workflows. Maybe it's also something that your teams already resent. Once you have a complete list, the ROI model is pretty straightforward. Feel free to use the calculator on our economics page to have a lot of this work done for you. Now let's assume that you can retire $1 million of annual SaaS spend. We'll budget something like $100,000 a year to operate the owned system, which includes hosting, security backups, and routine improvements, and maybe a half-time person to manage everything. The build costs $500,000, and the final SaaS contract expires 8 months from the project start. After the cutover, net annual savings are around $925,000 with a payback in, say, 10 months. By year 3, the company's avoided roughly $2.5 million in subscription fees. After the build costs, net cash return is just over $2 million, or about $5 of gross savings for every dollar billed. Now that's the hard dollar case. And of course it stands on its own, but it's important to also estimate 2 other forms of value that deserve consideration: strategic value and enterprise value. Strategic value is less precise than the cash case, to be fair, but it is real, and it comes from 3 things. First, when you do these operating systems, you get all of your operational data into one coherent system. The applicant tracking system can feed candidates into the HRIS, which can talk to the capacity planner, and so on. Second, you create the foundation for agents to work across the company because this system shares a single data model and it exposes consistent tools. Agentic workflows become realistic without building the same integration for every new model or system. And finally, and I think most importantly, the workflows and interfaces are yours. You own them. If the CFO needs a new dashboard, that can be a 2-hour job. Or if marketing needs an external data piece connected to the CRM, that can be done next week. You're no longer waiting on somebody else's product roadmap. That value is a bit hard to quantify, but 0 is not a serious estimate. So keep it separate from the cash case and make a judgment. In this model, let's assign $250,000 a year. Which brings us to enterprise value. If you're a 30-year-old family business with no plans to sell, this probably isn't relevant. But if there's an acquisition on the horizon, it makes sense to factor in the near-term savings SaaS replacement can drive. This estimates how much recurring EBITDA savings may add to the sales price. In our sample model, if $925,000 reaches EBITDA and a buyer credits it at 9 times multiple, that implies about $8,300,000 in potential enterprise value. Of course, a buyer may haircut that number, so again, keep it separate from the cash case, but it can still dwarf the $500,000 build cost. At this point, the project looks pretty attractive on paper, but much of the remaining delivery execution risk comes from sequencing. Replacing one system at a time is sensible for most companies, but the shared architecture still has to be designed with the full destination in mind. Or 5 rented SaaS data islands can quickly become 5 custom data islands, and we don't want that. This preliminary work explains why the first 4 to 8 weeks can actually feel kind of slow. What's happening is the team is getting access to old systems, setting up deployment infrastructure, working through identity, permissions, historical data, and cutover plans. From the outside, it might look like not much is happening, but once the foundation is stable, the pace changes dramatically because each new system can reuse deployment, authentication, permissions, and data structures. Work that took weeks can now start taking days. The shared foundation also determines the order. After identity comes single sign-on, then permissions, deployment, logging. In terms of what to replace, CRM is often one of the first major systems I look at. HubSpot is a useful example. In our client work, teams often use a relatively small portion of the broad product, but HubSpot's APIs expose all the objects, properties, and associations that we need for a controlled bridge and cut over to an owned operating system. We've replaced versions of that narrow CRM layer repeatedly, and the work can move quickly once the shared foundation exists. Now, every company is different. But for us, we often elect to leave things like payroll and QuickBooks in place because the financial and compliance risk can change the calculation. Common question we often hear from executives is who will maintain this custom system? There are usually 3 paths. You can outsource it, which we often do for clients. You can train the most technical person on the existing team, or you can hire someone, which we also help companies do. But it's important to remember that modern tooling has dramatically lowered the maintenance burden. In one company doing roughly $200 million in revenue, 1 full-time equivalent was enough to maintain and extend the system, and hosting was nominal relative to the SaaS spend that it replaced. So where should a CEO begin? Build the inventory and rank the systems by spend, workflow pain, and renewal date. Then run that hard dollar model against the full replacement program, not just one attractive system in isolation. Design the shared architecture before anybody starts rebuilding screens, and put an executive owner behind the cutover and adoption. Token spend is just an operating cost. The useful question is what recurring software those tokens can allow you to retire, and whether the replacement leaves the company with more control or less. If the math works and the organization can absorb the change, build. If not, keep renting.